Okay. Welcome, everybody from around the world. I'm Martini, child and adult analyst in the San Francisco Bay Area and a member of COCAP, the Committee on Child and Adolescent Psychoanalysis in the IPA. It's my honor to interview Dr. Mary Brady today about her new book, the first in our COCAP series entitled Psychoanalysis with Children and Adolescents Learning to Surf. The book is featured in the chat along with a 20% off discount from Routledge. The interview will be about an hour, after which we'll have 15 minutes for questions and comments. Please think about your questions along the way. We'll have just a little bit of time and hopefully make them brief. All right. Now I'd like to introduce Mary. Dr. Mary Brady is an adult and child psychoanalyst in San Francisco on the faculties of the San Francisco Center for Psychoanalysis and the Psychoanalytic Institute of Northern California. She is the recipient of the American Psychoanalytic Association's Rowton Award for her writing. Her book, Psychoanalysis with Adolescents and Children Learning to Surf, has just been published by Routledge. She is editor of Braving the Erotic Field in the Treatment of Children and Adolescents, author of Analytic Engagements with Adolescents and The Body in Adolescence. She is North American co-chair for the Committee on Child and Adolescent Psychoanalysis, the IPA, and is co-chair of the Committee of the Status of Women and Girls for APSA. For a decade, she has co-led a psychoanalysis and film group. So, to begin, the first and most obvious question, Mary, has to do with the title of the book. Please describe the metaphor you chose of learning to surf and how it applies so aptly to the work with this population.
Thank you, Anne, and lovely to see a lot of fond and familiar faces and some new ones. So very good to be here with you this morning. And the metaphor of the book of learning to surf, I think, is particularly apt with the treatment of adolescents. And my thinking went, I've been very much influenced by Bion and the metaphor he uses, which is, of course, is connected to his theory in general of being able to think under fire. And so that metaphor, is essential for me in my work. We have to be able to continue thinking even under all kinds of circumstances. And that is certainly true in work with adolescents, all kinds of things.
Sorry to interrupt. I'd like to ask all participants to please mute yourselves. Thank you.
Let's see, Anna is the IPA person. Anna, you were going to try to put Anne and me up. We're getting lots of faces of people's in cars and things like that. I don't know whether you can adjust that.
You are pinned, so I'll just ask everybody to mute themselves so it doesn't interrupt the feature.
Okay. We'd like to be able to see just Mary and my faces. Can we do that?
That's how I see on my side.
I'm seeing the IPA sign, and then sometimes I'm seeing either myself or Anne, but we were hoping it could have a feel of a conversation. But there I am. Okay. Anyway, back to my metaphor, and Anna will work on that, I'm sure. So that metaphor, I think, is a very helpful one, but I began to think that for adolescents, this image of surfing is more central. And they're so thrown by all the changes inside them and around them and the developmental process of, the need to withdraw from the parents internally, externally, because of the sexual upsurges inside. There we are. Yeah. And so they're thrown, and they're going to throw us. But then also, in addition to the sense of danger in surfing, that you can, you can be thrown, you can go under, you can hit a coral reef, but also there's the thrill of the ride and the joy. And so I think often as psychoanalysts, we're so good at talking about, what's wrong, because we need to be thinking about these things conceptually, but there's so much that, adolescence is both a terrible time of life and a wonderful time of life, that the kind of sense of these first moments that are so spectacular. And so I think it captures that for us. And I think it matters in terms of thinking with our patients. I'm thinking of a patient, just we'll talk in general terms, who had a sort of severe obsessional constriction right before high school. And that's, that's of course important to understand in its own right. But then there was also a great deal of health in her. And so you have to feel these kinds of excitements that are also underpinning the restrictions. And so I think with the metaphor of surfing, I'm also trying to think about the things that, of course, there are the teens who constrict themselves to try to miss this upheaval. And so the extreme of it is anorexia, but there's lots of other possibilities, just the sort of trying to stay out of any kind of experimentation. And then there's those who try to skip over adolescence, and again, it's an avoidance of the turbulence. And so there you see the kids who've been working on their resumes all their lives, and they're not having much fun. And then of course the kids who are experiencing the upsurge. So there's health in that, but they there's that surfers talk about how it's the waves are better near the coral reefs because they break there. And so there's the adolescents who really tend to the wild, and then get so lost and out of control that that's also a danger. But so I'm trying to balance the sense of the dangers of adolescence in the metaphor, but also the excitement. And I think for those of us who are able to really experience adolescence, it leaves a kind of feeling in the personality of a vitality that I think when people miss adolescence or avoid adolescence, they don't quite get to have. I'll stop there.
Thank you. So now I'd like to ask you more specifically about yourself. What aspects of your personal and professional history have led to your interest in an affinity to this population? Your capacity to identify with and connect to children and adolescents in particular is eloquently demonstrated in multiple clinical vignettes you offer in the book.
Thank you, Anne. Yeah. I mean, it's easy for me to say I'm, a bit of a rebel without a cause, or, with or without a cause. And so, but throughout my career, I'm not somebody that particularly planned on a special interest in adolescence, but it just emerged. And I think that's something for all of us, that the things we find that really draw us are part of, there's so many ways we can go within this broader field, and that's of interest itself. But I felt for some years that while I'd thought about why I was so drawn to the treatment of adolescents, and I wrote, most of my writing has been about the treatment of adolescents, but that there was something about it I didn't understand at the same time. And so, so that kind of Bionian feeling of the unknown, you have to live with the feeling of the unknown for some time. And at a certain point, what I realized was that, without going into too much detail about myself, but that there was some way that I had been in danger of almost missing the adolescent process. And and that, I think didn't wind up happening, but because of that danger, I think I have a special kind of feeling of protectiveness about the adolescent process that translates into sort of both interest and tolerance or patience or something like that. And so So I think that would be the heart of it. And then when I was even years ago as a candidate, I had 3 adolescents in analysis at the same time, and consultation about them, and so to get to be be with adolescents at a depth, and I think they get a bad rap as because they can be a bit hard to corral, but they, once they get going, they can be such interesting patients. And so I had one with an eating disorder, one with substance abuse, one with a kind of the erotic was quite foremost, and all of those became papers that that then the work to really deal with things that are so either dire or delicate has kind of spurred me forward.
Your personal style is so present and engaged, and you speak to your patients in plain, simple language aimed appropriately at their levels of development. But at the same time, the reader is keenly aware of the influence of theory in the background of your work. So please talk about the theorists. You credit Bion and Winnicott, each of whom you credit in different chapters, who've had the most influence on your work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if we're talking to kids and we're not talking in a kind of straightforward way, we'd be dead with them, and so, so that is, we're getting some static, yeah. So that's terribly important, but yes, having our internal conversations over decades with our consultants consultants are the theorists that are important to us. And as you say, in Bion and Winnicott come up throughout the book. And Bion, as I mentioned, his metaphor of thinking under fire, I find very helpful, but that's of course related to his whole, theory of the way unprocessed things are always coming at us from inside ourselves and from outside. And, in the work of alpha function and dreaming alpha and reverie. And so, and I think he would say, if he was here, I think that he would be interested in the metaphor of learning to surf, because he had there's a wonderful paper by Larry Brown in the International Journal about Bion's war experience and the influence on his theory. And so he was in World War I in terrible battle at 19. And then before then had been in, British boarding school. So he was not having fun in adolescence. So I can see why, the sort of feeling of the joy of it would have eluded him. I think he would have said that. But I think what's closer to what I'm trying to get at in this metaphor is his ideas of the only thing of importance in a clinical hour is the unknown. That to me comes close to this feeling of surfing, that we're trying to let something happen, not overform it. And so, so Bion is always with me. But then Winnicott, I think, is really the theorist of adolescence. And so he's very concerned with the how to put it, the environments that help create spontaneity. And so, his wonderful idea of the spontaneous gesture. And so with adolescents, again, they won't really let you be forcing them into molds, but you have to be ready to let them create the setting to some degree, to let them be who they are in their time with you, and not, we're fighting a tide of, at least, here in my environment in San Francisco, of, so much about creating these perfect kids with every possible talent and every, the resume at 17. And so I think we're going in quite a different direction in terms of, away from what Winnicott would call the false self, you know, and as I said, towards the spontaneous gesture. And so, those are some of his most important ideas in terms of the things I'm trying to talk about, but, but many related ones. His idea of the doldrums, I think, is quite wonderful and apt in adolescence. Again, is kind of needing to let adolescence take place in its own time. Let's see, I could go on, but well, maybe I'll stop there and let you go ahead.
Okay. Well, to sort of follow along this same line, are there mentors, consultants, or supervisors over the years from analytic training onward that you'd like to mention who've had an important impact on your development as a child and adolescent analyst?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I feel very fortunate in that way. And then just to say in general, it's, our work as analysts or analytic clinicians, we take people in over the years, whether it's theorists as I've been talking about, but also these, senior colleagues who in a way, become a part of us. And so I think of, Ray Poggi here in San Francisco. He's not a child analyst, but he, Bionian, very interested in group theory. And so that's been very influential in terms of, and he was the director of the adolescent unit at Menninger's years ago. And so I think he has a real sense of, he's helped me with some of my hardest cases where, you have to be thinking about what needs to change in the environment to allow, that because you're trying to give the child or adolescent a sense that we're not just asking them to change, and I mean, of course, especially when there's some terrible thing going on, but we're also, hopefully expecting to change ourselves in our work with them, expecting, that in the work with the parents, that the system can change. And so, so he's been influential to me in that way. I'm sure many more ways, but for shorthand. And then someone else that comes to mind, I don't know if people know, Robin Anderson, who was the director of the adolescent unit at the Tavistock, and I think he was the director of adolescent or child and adolescent training at the British Psychoanalytic. But, well, maybe I'll back up and say, when I was finishing my child analytic training eons ago, the prevailing point of view in child analysis in the United States was ego psychology. And so I was always interested in Klein and Winnicott and Bion and other theorists. And so I kind of looked outside, and he came and gave a paper in LA at the Kleinian Institute there on adolescence and the body ego. And so that really got me thinking about these kind of bodily issues that emerge in adolescence and what that has to do with the developmental changes of adolescence. And so that led to my book on the body in adolescence, where I'm talking about the kind of underpinnings of many issues in adolescence, the kind of withdrawal from, the internal and external objects, but then adolescents are so thrown back on themselves and their bodies, and the body becomes when kids are overwhelmed, the body really becomes the scene of the troubles. And so there are chapters in that book on eating disorders and cutting and substance abuse and suicide attempts. And so, his thinking was very helpful to me in kind of organizing my ideas about that. And then I think in the other two, and I think they may both be here, is Anne Alvarez and Virginia Ungar, both of whom are quite present in this book. Anne, I got to, I heard her give a paper on the stupid object years ago. It's probably 30 years ago now in San Francisco. And it's always stuck with me. And it led to, my development of the idea of the oblivious object, which is a chapter in this book. But, certainly inspired by her. And what else do I want to say about Anne? You know, just such a vibrant person. But there's other, so that chapter is most clearly inspired by her. You know, she has this kind of wonderful, frank way of talking.
Uh-oh.
Sorry, Mary. Can you just unmute yourself? I muted you. But
Okay, is that is that? Thank you. Yeah, so many.
Somebody else. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. So I was thinking about Anne's wonderful way of putting things plainly. You know, she talks about children who are hard to like, you know, and so that has to do with those ideas about the stupid. They consider their objects stupid or oblivious, you know, sometimes for good reason. But that can really become quite problematic because they have no, you know, hope in adults. So she certainly is influential to me. And there's another chapter in the book, you know, because again, she can talk, you know, in her work, you know, work in live company about the, you know, when we have a child in the room, it doesn't mean they're playing. You know, they may be doing something, but it doesn't mean they're really playing. And so she would talk about needing to draw the object, you know, to draw the child to you because, you know, they don't necessarily think you're alive, you know. And so for instance, Frances Tustin also similarly in her work, which I'm sure was influential to Anne, she talks about with autistic kids expecting to asking them to say hello and goodbye in the hours, and that it's not some, you know, effort to make them, you know, look normal or be socially acceptable. It's to kind of insist that you're there in a certain way. And so the you know, the particular boy I talk about in that paper, you know, I'm working with needing to pull him out of some play that is not play. And I'm talking about there's a kind of nightmare state he's in that, again, there's no symbolic feeling. He's just in it. And then there's a perseverative, very repetitive play. And then, you know, the kind of pulling him towards play and drawing. So that chapter, some of it also was influenced by Anne. And then, you know, and Virginia Ungar, who I know I've seen her square here, so I know she's here, but she came to San Francisco years ago, and again, have been fortunate to consult with her over the years. And then, you know, with both Anne and Virginia to get to do many projects with them, which has been such a pleasure. And so Virginia is part of a chapter in the book that's co-written that came out of a panel we did also with Adriana Prengler and Anna Belchior-Melicius. And maybe I'll say more about that if we can get to it later, but about the fantastic Spanish film Cría Cuervos. But so we've had these lovely times to work together, but I thought, you know, I was thinking about what to say about her because, you know, again, there's so much you could say, but I attended a COAP meeting yesterday, an interview of Juliet Mitchell, and Juliet Mitchell and Virginia had this wonderful exchange, you know, and the Margarita Cerrejito had been talking about Virginia being the first woman president of the IPA. And you know, how challenging it must have been to imagine oneself as a woman president when, you know, in patriarchy, when, you know, it hadn't existed before, you know, and of course no woman president of the United States yet. So to be able to imagine oneself into that, and then and also importantly to lead in a different way, you know, in a much more consensual way. And so I think for me, I mean, Virginia is very much the reason I'm as involved in the IPA as I am, because she's always inviting people in, and finding what they're good at. And so whoever's in analysis with her is fortunate, but I've been fortunate to have her as a mentor and friend. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Mary. So we've moved into some of the chapters in the book. You mentioned the oblivious object, which was influenced by Anne Alvarez's work. And you began to talk about the play space article, which also was influenced by her work. And before moving on to her, my attention was drawn to one of the techniques you used with, I think, the child you were talking about, where you created a timeout to draw to reestablish, I think, the capacity to think. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, certainly. So that little boy had terrible, kind of medical trauma, and so his play was full of death, terror, and so and what I'm talking about in general is this movement between these nightmare spaces and then understandably these very rigid, repetitive spaces where the familiarity and the control you can feel with the repetitive. And so of course some of that absolutely needs room, but at a certain point, and I use the word perseverative play or it's not really play, instead of just repetitive, because some repetitive things, there's something coming in and going on amongst the repetition, but with some kids, you feel they're really never going to get out of the over and over and over again. And so it's, it's of course takes a lot of internal work to see where you need to wait, you need to be disciplined and wait. And then other times when they're not going to be able to imagine what else could happen, and imagine what else could happen with you without your kind of helping them imagine it for them and with them. And so drawing, of course, is a wonderful part of play therapy. And this kid would draw. And so at times I would say, like in 10 minutes, we're going to draw. And so there was some sense of a limit of the perseverative play. But then I think with a sense of that more would happen in the drawing. And, of course, people like Farrow talk about this, the way an internal emotional scene emerges in a kind of dreamlike way in drawings. And so, drawing, dreaming, these things are related. And so his drawings were just full of horror, really, monsters, but in such a real way, like Medusa. He was a very bright little boy, snakes in the hair. And anyway, just kind of the drawings themselves were horrible, but I think that what can emerge, and Meltzer talks about this, that that things can become to be in what he means it in a positive way, fixed on the page. So in other words, the monstrous feeling becomes less of almost a hallucination. These things are just happening to me, and more something that begins to be a bit under the child's control, that they're developing that drawing, and we can return to that drawing and that character on the page. And so I think it was quite helpful. And I mean, of course, we all know, Winnicott's squiggle game, but so I do that sometimes when I feel a kid's play is perseverative, and it's also got to do with this being there, that you will be in the space of what the child's developing, you know, most of the time, and, you know, almost all of the time, but that, you know, if you are bored out of your mind, you know, it might be that it's a very, you know, kind of dead rote way of being. And so then your own experience is also part of the, you know, part of the work, of course. So I'll stop there.
So we'll move on to another chapter. Henri Ray's influence on you is evident as well in the chapter on the fear of eating the mother, which was one of my favorite chapters, which to me read as an homage to Ray's incredible work at the Maudsley Clinic with patients with severe eating disorders, problem that faces most clinicians, you know, working with this population today. So I felt it was a, you know, an homage to Ray's writings derived from, you know, that period in his work. And in the treatment of the patient discussed in this chapter, you delve into the fantasy that underlies her eating disorder. Do you want to comment on that and on the usefulness of Ray's ideas in your work?
Yes, certainly. You know, we're getting an echo again, Anna. So yeah, I mean, I did part of that chapter comes from, I think that his work is under known in, at least in the US, in child analysis, and I think extremely helpful in the treatment of eating disorders. And so he has a way of understanding psychotic kinds of very concrete thinking in such an accessible way. And so it comes across in the way he talks to the patient. This is in his book Universals in Psychoanalysis, in his chapter on anorexia. But you know, so that the way he's talking to her, he uses the phrase that thinking as she does, it's only right that she's not eating, you know, so she is what, you know, she believes that eating is the same as eating the mother, you know, which is killing the mother. And so it's a very concrete version of something that is absolutely an adolescent fantasy. And I mean, he's talking about a girl in this chapter, but, you know, he is well aware of eating disorders in boys, but let me see if I can gather my thoughts about, so there's these fantastic drawings of this patient in the book, and that are like her drawing of a tree, speaking of drawings, you know, kind of growing up, and then it's like taking the nutrients from the soil, so the mother tree, so to speak, withers away and dies. And so, you know, so you can see again what he means by thinking as she does, then you know, she wouldn't eat. And so that's, you know, these ideas are so important, but you know, there are also echoes of them in all adolescents. And then I think any child analyst is going to recognize the, you know, fantasies about food and eating, you know, from early on. I remember having, when I was little, having, you know, a kind of fantasy that the egg came back together, you know, like as if the little shell was back on it inside your stomach with a little, you know, I think I had a little story in my head of, he had a little top hat and you know, sort of a character inside, but you can see that comes from this idea that, you know, chewing and swallowing are, you know, harmful. And so, or destructive, aggressive. And so, you know, so he's working with these ideas, I think, in kind of a, you know, a wonderful way. And this, she was like barely alive. This girl was being tube fed. But what was one of the things that was interesting was that she didn't mind being tube fed, you know, so it was also about, she didn't want to be large and the meanings of large, but I think you know, it was almost more centrally about this idea of, you know, the destruction of the mother in in chewing and eating and swallowing. And so that it's as if that the responsibility of that was taken away in the tube feeding. But and then this wonderful, of course, he didn't have the influence of Bion at that point, but he, he does talk about, the symbolic, the reestablishment of the symbolic, not that eating disorder patients can't be quite symbolic in other areas, but around eating and food, not so much. And so also, the work in the transference so that the analyst becomes another route forward, as well as the use of these kind of the symbolism of that can develop around the eating, that that you could think of as this development of narrative derivatives and kind of Bionian, post-Bionian thinking, that the growth of the mind around the the kind of central fears develops. So I'll stop there again. Mm-hmm.
Going back a little ways in the book, I haven't asked you yet about the second chapter of the book, Daddy's Head is Broken, in which you poignantly bring us into the world of a little girl whose father is an alcoholic. Your ability to help her face his illness was very moving to me. Maybe you can talk a bit about the challenges of working with this population, one of which in your case, and I think in many, was keeping the mother as an ally.
Yeah, I think, of course, we're always thinking when we start work with children or adolescents, where is the center of the problem, right? And so in this, in some settings, I've worked with a number of, kids who have a parent, fortunately, seems to have been my experience, with very severe alcoholism or addiction, and that where this just terrifying and confusing experiences that come from that. And so I think there are things to say about the immediate effects on the children of how confusing this is, but maybe to stay with the parent part, the work to see who you can work with, and then so in all of the cases that I'm thinking of, there were divorces, there was one parent that was the parent that could more protect the child. And so working with that parent to free themselves from, being kind of mentally dominated by an addicted parent was terribly important. And so at times I would see that other parent grow quite a bit to come out from under the again, like a kind of system of addiction. And so so that work was terribly important. So you're certainly working at both levels all the time to strengthen the parent that can help keep, because of course it's really keeping a child safe and keeping them also from, just sometimes it feels like it's just going to be a lifetime of impact of one confusing scene after another, with the addicted parent. And so these things are, and then of course it's so hard for little children to understand what addiction is and to make sense of what's going on around them. Often you see as kids get older, they can understand something more about this need for this substance, and but it's still very confusing. And so, but I think one of the things I'm trying to get at, the French use that phrase of the symptom carrier for the family, and so it's not unusual that you have the child brought to treatment But then you're really what you're dealing with, in many ways is the background of a parent that, I've had parents with, planes need to land because the parent is having, seizures on the plane from withdrawals, or, just ambulances and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so the impact of these things on a child, and, being able to help them face what is, happening in their lives, and then at the same time to protect a space for their, for their own development that isn't just the impact of this addiction. So if that gets at what you're wondering about.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe we could say something further about work with parents in the treatment of children, because there is no treatment of children without some kind of alliance with parents. And yet that's very difficult sometimes to attain and maintain. Is there any particular theory or way of thinking? You were alluding to it a little bit with the idea of the child as the symptom carrier that guides your work with parents.
Yeah, and I mean, I think in a way it's it's Bion more than anyone else, although, he didn't see children, but I think he was enormously sympathetic to child analysis. There's a wonderful quote by him where, he says something like, people say that, small children can't be analyzed because their myelin hasn't developed, enough. And, but the real problem is in most adult, a lot of adults, the myelin is so stiff, nothing can get through it. And so I think, of course, he was in analysis with Klein. And so his thinking about childhood in general, is very influenced by that. But then I love Bion's group thinking. And so, if people haven't read his Experiences in Groups book, I think that very much influences my thinking when I'm working with parents. And so, so I'm always trying to, think about the unconscious group dynamic of the family, as well as the, the individual unconscious of the child, of each of the parents, the group fears in the family, the group defenses in the family. And so that, I did write a paper about this. It's not in this book, but I think it's in my analytic engagements with adolescents book. But that's the, what's the title of it? But the working with parents, Bion's group theory. So I think that his work influences me the most. And of course, as we all know, there's times you run into limits of what is possible with, sometimes with one parent or sometimes with both. For instance, with these severely addicted parents I'm talking about would be an extreme of it. But I try to convey to parents in the beginning parent work that the work will be more powerful if we can, kind of all be able to reflect on what's gone on, in their childhoods, that then, the ways they were raised, the group cultures of their families that affect their ways of being parents, what they want to keep from that, what they want to let go of that. And so, of course, all parents are not really open to that, but I'm trying for that. And then I'm, and I'm, of course, kind of ask parents permission to work in that way, to, to see what observations I might have or we might have that might have to do with their own, their own growing up. So.
Yeah. Moving on, I love the chapter on fascism and its influence on the mind in the movie Cría Cuervos. I also loved how you were able to describe the interface in the child's mind between unconscious wishes, fantasy, and reality, and how that's influenced not only by the child's developmental level, but by the oppressive forces around her. So maybe you'd like to say something about that article, also about your longstanding interest in film and psychoanalysis, and now in the current political culture, something about the encroachment of fascism into our lives, our practices, and the minds of our patients.
Yeah, and of course, in the U.S. right now, it's, you know, it's pretty terrible. The growth of fascism, the fascist turn in many parts of the world right now. That paper came from a panel that I did with, the wonderful Virginia Ungar, wonderful Adriana Prengler, and wonderful Anna Belchior Malicius. And I think all three of them had, Virginia and Adriana had experienced fascist regimes in Argentina. Anna had, under Portuguese fascism, had moved to Angola, Portuguese colony. So at the time, it felt like they, more than I, had direct experience of fascism. We all do, in that there's always fascist elements in our world, but right now in the United States, there's such a turn in that direction that that's extremely upsetting. And so, of course, the family culture influences a child, the societal culture influences a child, and often through the influence on the family culture, as well as in larger ways, but especially for young children. And so if people haven't seen this film, Cría Cuervos, it's just a fantastic film. The heroine is this little girl, Anna, who's, I think, 4 or 5. And her father is a fascist military officer under Franco. And so the Saura, the director, of course, was working. The film was made right at the end of the Franco period as he was dying, but he, and other directors of that period were working under censorship. So how things are conveyed, and and of course, again, makes me think so much of right now in the United States. People, I'm sure, are reading about this, but law firms that are being kind of locked out of various functions, but then they capitulate to the rule, to Trump's rules, and to universities likewise, having funding withdrawn, people being more or less disappeared, who are protesters who don't have full citizenship. But you can see the progression that can happen. And so the little girl in this film she's both we call her a wise child, because she can see what's happening around her and following out her emotional truths. So she tries to kill her father, basically, and it's in a childish way. The father happens to die of other causes, and so she thinks she has murdered her father, which in fact she has not. But so you see both the internalization. The title of the film, Cría Cuervos, comes from a Spanish proverb, which means raise ravens and they'll peck your eyes out. And so you see her murderousness, but it's along with her search for truth and her revenge. She feels that the father is responsible for her mother's death, which again is not literally true, but his harshness and sense of a la Trump, a la Franco, he can do whatever he wants and let the people suffer, sort of thing, let the family suffer. All of these things are in the film. And so I think, when we spend time with films like this that help us to understand things. And so yes, for years I've had, for 10 years, I've co-led a film group with a film scholar here in San Francisco. That's been quite a wonderful experience, psychoanalysis and film. I think I again saw quickly in the little boxes, I think some people from that group might be here, but so part of it is the experience of art itself, and that this kind of art is a social container, because a film like that both is conveying a kind of interpretation of historical events as well as memorializing them. And I'm sure we could think of many films that's true for. But also the experience of, it was funny during COVID, I wondered whether, because we had been in person for years, and then whether the group would survive the online thing. And it so much did. And I think it was because it was so good to be together, to reflect on artistic experience when everyone was so deprived of artistic experience during the time, and shared artistic experience. And then, but, continuing, so the group, many of whom have been in the group for years, also together go through these societal changes that are reflected in film. And so the group itself, I think, becomes a kind of creative bulwark for, for the changes, oppressive changes we have to go through. And so I think both art, and here, talking about film, is a kind of resistance to oppression, but then also the experience of doing that with other people is a resistance to oppression. And so this last year we did the creative process on film, because I think we all needed to spend time. We read a lot of Winnicott and Milner, and I think we all needed some refueling in the current moment. And then this year we're going to do The Perversion of Power on film for obvious reasons. And so, that's been a wonderful experience. And then I will also just mention, for 10 years, I also co-led a adolescent treatment group, treatment of adolescents and young adults. And that too, it was such a good fortune to spend a lot of time with people with shared concerns, and who hear the cases, and to share that literature together, and to people having a kind of common commitment. So that was also really a joy on a slightly different. It kind of lets you deepen into an area that the treatment of adolescence leads you so many other places, as we were talking about eating disorders, for instance, that also, take so much thought.
Okay. Well, I have one more question, which you mentioned COVID, and drawing on your own work articulated in your book, The Body in Adolescence, Psychic Isolation and Physical Symptoms. You address the impact of COVID on adolescent development and the challenges presented by remote work, along with an unexpected positive impact in one of your cases. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how you handled the isolation of the therapist-patient or the analyst-patient contact by having to meet online when we're accustomed to seeing our patients in person. And how did you work to mitigate the deadening impact of technology and physical distance on the analytic process?
Well, probably no better than anyone else, but it is interesting to think back. Every now and then, one of my say adolescents will say something about referring back to that time, and you have the experience with them of it's still hard to take in all that happened, in that period. And that, I talk about in that paper the disparity of outcomes economically speaking. I mean, obviously the death rate of parents was so much higher, in poorer populations, but who, could be, were in less protected in various ways. But also here, and I'm sure in many places, the kids who are in public school missed almost like 2 years of in-person school, whereas the kids in the private schools, often the private schools were more able to, much more nimble in rallying to do outdoor school and things like that, so that those kids were at least less affected. And so that's a difficulty. But and then also I'm talking about my idea of psychic isolation in adolescence, which doesn't necessarily mean that there's physical isolation, but that this combination of a sort of withdrawal that takes place in adolescence, that then when, the lack of real social contact could be very harmful. And so, I'm thinking of kids that, again, lost this, one kid who had been quite depressed before COVID, was kind of coming out of it for various reasons, and had kind of just begun to make some friends at school. And then COVID hit. And so developmentally, there's so many things that are important about friendship, for instance, that when, with the withdrawal from parents, the experience of a best friend is, can so much kind of fill the breach. And then it's also kind of a practice for being a couple in a certain way. So when kids are deprived of this opportunity, even when they're beginning to be capable of it, I talked about that one kid that I thought was very severely impacted by COVID, and the online, the experience of everything going online, her therapy, her school. And for a long time, I mean, both the school, she was in public school, and so missing 2 years of in-person school, but also she had a medical condition that I would have seen her in person sooner, but she was going to have to take the bus. And so the bus exposure would have been too dangerous. So it was also 2 years of online treatment. And so this recapitulated the absence of the adults, our removal from her recapitulated a loss of a parent she had suffered. And so I think her underlying rage at all of us disappearing, was very, very, very difficult. And then the other kid I talk about in this article, again, a wealthier kid, and it was almost the opposite effect, because what happened is, this sort of hyper successful, busy family had more time for each other. And so he had been withdrawn from his parents beforehand, maybe partly for developmental reasons, but more, he's somebody I would talk about in terms of that oblivious object idea. He thought adults were useless, and so he didn't speak to them. And so the time together allowed, along with him being in analysis during that time, allowed a level of contact and work that resolved some of the most extreme of what was going on for him. So it hit, it hit people in different ways. But I know, we want to leave some time to hear from what's on other people's minds. So I will stop there. But okay.
Thanks so much, Mary, for your generosity and sharing so much. We're going to turn to discussion and questions. Will everybody either put them in the chat. We will have a few questions from the chat and then use the raise hand function. And Anna, our assistant from the IPA, will assemble those raised hands and call on you. Anna, are you there?
I'm here.
Yeah.
I'm here.
Okay. And Mary and my colleague, Holly Gordon, will be assembling the chat questions, and maybe Holly, you can notify me. Do you want to text me if you can, if you have some questions from the chat?
Or I could just raise a hand and read from the chat.
Oh, okay. That would even be easier. Thank you.
I put everybody on panel, like remove the spotlight from you too?
Sure. It looks like Jean is, Magana has her hand raised in.
Yes, so Jean?
You can
I think you'll have to
yourself
unmute
in.
yourself.
Thanks, Mary. I think everybody's going to want to read your book after this. It was very interesting. I had a question about, I was so pleased to hear you talking about parent work. I am so surprised when I go to a new place and I hear about the work with the individual child, and I say, and who sees the parents? And there's not parent work being done. And I'm puzzling. I was so pleased to hear that you said Beyond was involved, but I'm puzzling. Do you understand why people leave out the second part, which you're talking about, which is the work with the parents?
Oh my God, yeah, no. I feel like, oh my God, how can that be? I know people in different regions, I don't know if it's still the case, but I think often in Britain, people thought Americans were kind of crazy to be trying to do the child work and the parent work. And in Britain, it at times has been more, and you can tell me whether that's still true, that that the work was divided, and obviously there are advantages to that in terms of one person not carrying all the work. But the advantage, I think, to seeing the parents oneself is you have such an immediate experience of what it's like to be with these parents, and sometimes can, for better and worse, feel what it's like for the child. And I think, certainly it can be true that some adolescents take a very dim view of us talking to their parents. And so that's something that, needs negotiation at the very least. Like I think about, I've had kids that will close to insist that you not see their parents, because sometimes with some adolescents, I will start with the adolescent because, let them tell their story first and then say, we need, your parents will want to get a look at me and have some buy-in to the treatment. And so I do need to meet with your parents. And so there's certainly been teenagers where I might wish I could see the parents more, that would be, and there's parents where teenagers where at a certain point I can make the referral to some other person to treat them. But my only thought about why anyone would try to see a kid or a teenager without work with the parents would be taking too much from a view of adult analysis, as if you can treat a child without knowing they're so immediately in the atmosphere of a family, and as if they can really make the choice for treatment by themselves, because you need the support of the family. And so so I do think, I think of child analysis and adult analysis, as Pharaoh says, they're one in the sense of, the work with the unconscious, but they're different in terms of, obviously an adult patient can fire you, but it's a terrible situation if you can't work with a child because the parent is not enough involved. So I'm sorry to hear that, Jean.
Thank
And
you.
I will say, Jean is a specialist in the treatment of eating disorders, amongst other things. And so we've had the good fortune to work together here and there.
Okay.
We have Terrence raised his hand, Mary.
Okay.
Good morning,
Terry.
Mary, and thank you for this presentation this morning and talking about your work. I was just sort of riffing on learning to surf.
Are you a surfer, Terry?
No, I should have, but I didn't. I mean, that may be one of my true regrets, because when I moved to California, I moved to Santa Cruz. I lived
Yes.
just, not far from Steamer Lane. So
Excellent.
I watched a lot. But I'm sort of thinking of learning to surf and the use of the surfboard. And I was sort of riffing on the idea of our in our treatments, do we become the surfboard? Are we that steady piece that we allow that hopefully the child will hop on us, so to speak, and sort of ride the waves of their emotional and if you watch a surfer, the good ones move up and back and forth on the board. And how do we steady ourselves when our patients are gaining confidence so they can get off their knees, so to speak, because that's where a lot of the surfers start, is on their knees. How can they get up, and how can we keep ourselves balanced under them to keep them stable so they can ride that emotional wave until they start to internalize their own sense of balance? And the other thing I was thinking of is, if you watch surfers, seldom do they surf alone.
Right.
There's usually a pod of surfers out there that, in the culture that I understand, is that if someone has a bad fall, they all go to them. So I was just sort of riffing on the learning to surf metaphor, and I think it's really nice. I've used it with my kids every now and then, but for you to elaborate it on into a whole volume of writings, I think is really a good one. So thank you. It stimulated all these images I had in my mind and in my memories, and so that's where I'm at. Thank you.
That's wonderful, Terry. And I hadn't quite thought of the analyst as the surfboard. I was kind of thinking of the surfing with them image, but yeah, something that's solid, but also can be thrown with them, right? And that that's I think that's part of what I'm trying to get across. And there's no way we're not going to get thrown with them. I was more picturing the surfing with them, but that this is a little bit different, and this is in the Oblivious Object chapter, but I had a kid who, for various reasons, the parents kind of stopped supporting the treatment, and the kid was in dire shape. And I had a dream that I was on a ship, so with different levels, and that the ship had gone upside down, and so there'd be an air pocket in each level, but you'd be both upside down and underwater, and so that it's not exactly the surfing metaphor, but it's the same kind of thing. You're that obviously the kid was upside down and underwater, and you have to go through that with them to experience the level of danger and terror, and in that case kind of suffocate, drowning, danger of drowning. But I'm going to think of myself as a surfboard now, Terry.
Well, just one last thing. Surfboards and the surfer are tethered. Surfboard they have a tether that's attached, so whether that has an umbilical cord sort of meant quality to it is another something to sort of play with. But when the kid falls or the surfer falls, they don't lose contact with each other. They find each other through this thing. So anyway, that's the last of it. All right.
And my last riff, I was just in Tulum for a wedding, and there was a party boat the night before. Believe me, I'm not always on party boats, but you know, the fun of it was jumping off the boat into the ocean and, you know, then being in it again, not quite surfing. I have to confess, I'm not a surfer either, but that feeling of the joy of it, you know, is also obviously what I'm trying to stay with, that the dangers, but then the liberating feeling, you know, that I had the glimpse of. So.
And we have Virginia Unger. Hola, Virginia.
Hola. Hola.
Hola.
Hola. Gracias. Thank you. And I would like to take the opportunity to congratulate Mary on this new publication, which speaks again of her creativity, her deep commitment to psychoanalysis, and if you know her amazing, enormous capacity to work. And I think that the whole presentation and the exchange with Anne was very interesting, and it becoming more interesting now that there is a conversation. I was thinking about what hello Jean, said. And I think that you are right. Today it's impossible, I think, to imagine psychoanalytic work with a child without having contact with parents. But I think it has to do with an evolution in the evolution of the history of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis was first centered in what happened. This is my words, with the patient, then with the developments around projective identification and countertransference. The focus, in a way, was on the analyst mind. Then a third time, the analytic field. But I think that now we are living in a fourth time, or a different time, what's happening all over the world, we can say. We cannot take into account the context. And of course, when I was trained, I started with treating children, and my supervisors advised me not to see the parents more than once a year.
Oh my God.
And that this was, when I'm raising the Kleinian, I was raising the Kleinian tradition. So, the prevalence of psychic reality is still part of my way of thinking in psychoanalysis. But I think that it's impossible now not to be in contact, or sometimes I also include mother or father in a session if it's needed. So I think that this is a positive development, because, and moreover during adolescence. And one more thing, because I don't want to take your time, I think that it's what you said and what, Terence said. I think that there is, working with adolescents is very difficult. It's very risky, and we are always, surfing. That's why I found your metaphor to be excellent. But it's when you work with an adolescent who understands what the psychoanalytic work means, is the best thing that can happen for an analyst. It's truly rewarding. Thank you, Mary, and thank you all.
Catherine, do you want to say something really quickly? We're just about at time.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize. Well, I'll just say first that, Mary, this is a wonderful book. The breadth, the depth of it, all that you've shared today, really impressive. So I was just going to comment on the idea of the adolescent who has avoided the turbulence, and how you understand that, and within the family context, and then how you as an analyst you have to draw that forward in some way, I would think, and how you prepare yourself for that. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
I think we're going to have to end. We're at time. Thank you so much, Mary. It's been a pleasure. And thanks to everybody for participating.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you for being with us. Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Anna.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. This was wonderful.